If you're enjoying this story about courage and dignity in the face of manipulation, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more compelling narratives that will touch your heart. Now, let's begin our journey with Helen. The flowers were exquisite, cascading white roses and delicate orchids that decorated the wedding venue with elegance and grace. Unfortunately for Helen Marlowe, they weren't just decorative elements. They were her companions for the evening, strategically positioned to obscure her from view. At 67, with silver hair pulled into a neat bun and wearing a powder blue dress she'd spent weeks selecting, Helen sat alone at a table hidden behind the floral arrangement, effectively invisible to the other wedding guests. Her daughter Lydia looked radiant in her wedding gown, dancing with her new husband Ethan Caldwell, tall, charismatic, with a dazzling smile that seemed to charm everyone in the room. Everyone except Helen, who noticed how his eyes never quite matched his smile when he looked in her direction. "More champagne, Mrs. Marlowe?" A server appeared briefly, breaking her solitude. "No, thank you," Helen replied, her voice carrying the soft lilt of Charleston that decades of teaching elementary school children had never diminished. She glanced down at her left hand, at the wedding band she still wore despite Richard's passing 18 months ago. The memories flooded back, Richard's final days, the whispered conversations, his insistence that she keep their financial situation private, even from their daughter. "Promise me, Helen," he had said, holding her hand with surprising strength for someone so ill. "What we've built is for you, your security. Lydia is finding her own way." What Richard had built was far more than anyone suspected. The modest high school history teacher had quietly amassed a real estate portfolio of beachfront properties worth $80 million. Investments made decades ago when coastal land was still affordable. Properties that had appreciated beyond anyone's wildest expectations. Only their attorney, James O'Connor, knew the extent of their wealth. Helen watched as Lydia laughed at something Ethan whispered in her ear. Her daughter had always been impulsive, falling in and out of relationships with alarming speed. Her whirlwind romance with Ethan, a business entrepreneur with ambitious plans, had culminated in today's lavish wedding, organized and largely financed by Ethan himself. Helen had offered to help, but her suggestions had been politely dismissed. "Mrs. Marlowe?" A young woman approached her table, navigating around the floral barrier. "The photographer would like to take some family photos now." Helen nodded, straightening her dress as she stood. "Of course." As she made her way across the ballroom, she caught fragments of conversation from Ethan's business associates, something about investments and capital needs. One phrase in particular caught her attention. "Once he has access to family resources." The photographer positioned Helen at the edge of the family grouping, almost as an afterthought. She smiled anyway, her expression revealing nothing of her inner thoughts. She had spent decades teaching young children, mastering the art of patience and restraint. Those skills would serve her well in the days to come. She could feel it. Later, as the reception wound down, Lydia approached her mother, Ethan's arm firmly around her waist. "Mom, we're heading out soon for the honeymoon. I hope you enjoyed yourself tonight," Lydia said, her voice carrying a hint of obligatory concern. "It was beautiful, darling. You make a stunning bride," Helen replied, embracing her daughter. When she moved to hug Ethan, she felt his body stiffen slightly before he reciprocated with a mechanical pat on her back. "Mrs. Marlowe," he said, his voice smooth as polished marble, "we should get together when we return. There are some family matters we should discuss." Helen met his gaze steadily. "I'd like that, Ethan. Family is important." As they walked away, Helen gathered her small purse and wrap. The server who had offered champagne earlier appeared again. "Would you like me to call you a taxi, ma'am?" Helen smiled. "No need. I have my car. But thank you for your kindness tonight. Sometimes it's the small courtesies that matter most." She drove home to her modest colonial house, the one she and Richard had purchased 40 years ago when they were just starting out. It was comfortable, familiar, and paid for, like everything else Richard had carefully arranged before his death. As she turned the key in the lock, her neighbor Margaret's porch light flicked on. "How was the wedding?" Margaret called, stepping outside in her robe. "Beautiful," Helen replied, "but I think my real challenges are just beginning." 7 days after the wedding, Helen sat in her sunroom, grading papers from her third-grade class. Despite reaching retirement age, she continued teaching, finding purpose in shaping young minds. The morning light filtered through the windows, illuminating the collection of children's thank-you notes she had displayed on the walls. The doorbell rang, breaking her concentration. Through the peephole, she saw Ethan standing on her porch, accompanied by a man carrying a briefcase. Helen took a deep breath before opening the door. "Ethan, what a surprise. I thought you and Lydia would still be in Bali." Helen's voice was warm, betraying none of her apprehension. "We cut it short. Business matters," Ethan replied, his smile not reaching his eyes. "This is Calvin Dreyer, my attorney. We wanted to discuss some important family matters with you." Helen gestured them inside, leading them to her living room rather than the more intimate kitchen where she usually entertained guests. "Can I offer you some tea?" "No need," Ethan said, settling into an armchair as if he owned it. "We won't take much of your time." Calvin Dreyer opened his briefcase, extracting a document folder. "Mrs. Marlowe, Ethan has been concerned about your living situation since Mr. Marlowe's passing. Managing finances and property can be overwhelming at your age." Helen's expression remained pleasant, though she noted the condescension in his tone. "That's thoughtful, but I'm managing quite well." Ethan leaned forward. "Mom, may I call you Mom? We're worried. This house is too much for you to maintain alone. And frankly, we're concerned about your financial decisions moving forward." "What specific decisions concern you?" Helen asked mildly. Dreyer intervened smoothly. "Mrs. Marlowe, we've prepared a durable power of attorney that would allow Ethan to help manage your affairs. It's quite standard for someone in your position. Widowed, aging, with significant responsibilities." Helen accepted the document, scanning it carefully. Her years of reading fine print on school permission slips had honed her attention to detail. The power of attorney was comprehensive, granting Ethan complete control over all her assets with no limitations or oversight. "This seems quite thorough," she commented, turning a page. "Who prepared this document?" "My firm drafted it to Ethan's specifications," Dreyer replied. "It's designed to protect your interests." Helen placed the document on the coffee table. "I appreciate the concern, but I already have estate planning documents in place with my attorney, James O'Connor." Ethan's smile faltered. "O'Connor is retired, Mom. His practices are outdated. This is about protecting you and your assets." "My assets?" Helen asked, her voice still gentle but carrying a new edge. "The house, your pension, whatever investments Richard left," Ethan elaborated, waving his hand dismissively. "We want to make sure everything is properly managed." Helen stood, smoothing her skirt. "I'll need to review this with my own attorney before signing anything. James may be semi-retired, but he still advises me." Ethan's charm evaporated momentarily. "This isn't complicated, Helen. It's a standard document that gives me the ability to help you make decisions. Lydia agrees it's for the best." "Where is Lydia today?" Helen asked. "Shopping for the new house," Ethan replied. "We're looking at properties in the historic district. The right home would elevate my business profile considerably." Helen nodded, understanding more than she let on. "I'll need time to consider this. Teaching keeps my mind sharp, you know. I like to understand documents before signing them." Dreyer began gathering his papers, clearly disappointed. "Of course, Mrs. Marlowe. But I should mention that these protections are best put in place before any issues arise. Age-related cognitive decline can come on suddenly." Helen walked them to the door. "I'm due for my annual checkup next month. I'll be sure to ask my doctor about cognitive assessments. Thank you for your concern." After closing the door, Helen watched through the window as they conversed intensely in the driveway before departing. She picked up her phone and dialed a familiar number. "James, it's Helen Marlowe. I need to see you as soon as possible. Yes, it's about the properties. And James, I think we need to move quickly. She hung up and walked to her kitchen, putting on the kettle for tea. Through the window, she saw Margaret in her garden, pruning roses. Helen made a decision and grabbed a second mug from the cupboard. Some situations called for reinforcements, and Margaret, a retired family court judge, had both wisdom and discretion to offer. As the kettle whistled, Helen's phone chimed with a text from Lydia. "Mum, hope you're considering Ethan's offer to help. We only want what's best for you. Love you." Helen stared at the message, her heart heavy. The chessmen were moving on the board, and she needed to plan her strategy carefully. The following afternoon, Helen sat in James O'Connor's wood-panelled office, a space that reflected its owner's preference for tradition and privacy. At 72, James had technically retired, but maintained a select client list, of which Helen had been a part for decades. "He wants control of everything," Helen explained, showing James the power of attorney document. "Not just assistance or oversight, complete control." James studied the document through his reading glasses, his frown deepening. "This is extraordinarily broad. No limitations, no reporting requirements, no co-agents. It would effectively transfer all your legal authority to your son-in-law, who seems very interested in my financial situation despite knowing nothing about it," Helen added. James removed his glasses. "Have you given any indication of Richard's investments?" "None. Richard was adamant that our financial situation remain private. Even Lydia doesn't know." Helen twisted her wedding band. "Richard always said that inheritance often destroys families faster than poverty." James nodded sagely. "Wise man. Did Ethan mention anything specific about his interest in your assets?" Helen recalled the conversation she'd overheard at the wedding. "Not directly, but I gathered he's having business difficulties. He mentioned buying a house in the historic district. Those start at $3 million. "On what income?" James asked. "Exactly. And there's something else." Helen hesitated. "Yesterday, after they left, I noticed my mail had been disturbed. Bank statements that had been in my desk drawer were slightly out of order." James's expression hardened. "Helen, this concerns me greatly. Let me be direct. I believe Ethan is prospecting. He suspects Richard left more than a modest teacher's pension, and he's fishing for information to confirm his suspicions." Helen sighed. "I fear you're right. What should I do?" "We need to secure your assets immediately." James pulled out a legal pad. "First, we'll record new deeds for all properties, placing them in the irrevocable trust Richard established. Second, we'll implement a credit freeze with all 3 major bureaus. Third, we'll create a document protocol for any future paperwork. Nothing gets signed without independent legal review." Helen listened carefully, taking notes of her own. "And Lydia? She's texted me 3 times asking if I've signed Ethan's document." James's expression softened. "That's the hardest part, Helen. You need to maintain the appearance of modest means while protecting your actual assets. It means continuing to live as you have been, and potentially disappointing your daughter by not being the financial resource her husband hopes you'll be." "I can do that," Helen said firmly. "But I worry about their marriage when Ethan realizes there's no windfall coming." "That's not your responsibility," James reminded her gently. "Your responsibility is to honor Richard's wishes and protect what he built for you." Helen nodded, her resolve strengthening. "Let's proceed with everything. And James, I'd like to make one additional arrangement, a trust for Lydia that activates only if she's not married to Ethan. Richard would want her protected, just not exploited." James smiled approvingly. "I'll draw up the paperwork. In the meantime, keep your financial documents secure. Use Margaret as your witness for anything important. And Helen, don't underestimate Ethan. Men pursuing money can be remarkably persistent." As Helen left the office, her phone rang. It was Lydia. "Mom, Ethan and I would like to come over for dinner tonight. There's something important we need to discuss." Helen took a deep breath. "I'd love to see you, sweetheart. How about 7 o'clock? "Perfect. And Mom, Ethan really is trying to help. Please keep an open mind. Always, darling, Helen replied, already planning how to navigate the evening ahead. She stopped at the grocery store, selecting ingredients for Richard's favorite pot roast recipe. As she cooked, she rehearsed what she would say, knowing that tonight would be a defining moment in her relationship with her daughter. The aromas of rosemary and garlic filled the kitchen, bringing memories of family dinners when Lydia was young and Richard was alive. Simpler times when love wasn't complicated by hidden agendas. At precisely 7 p.m., the doorbell rang. Helen straightened her shoulders, put on her warmest smile, and went to greet her visitors, armed with nothing but truth and the quiet strength that had sustained her through decades of life's challenges. The dinner began pleasantly enough, with Lydia enthusiastically describing their honeymoon and the properties they were considering purchasing. Helen served the pot roast with roasted potatoes and glazed carrots, comfort food that had always been a family favorite. "This is delicious, Mrs. Marlowe," Ethan said, using his most charming tone. "Lydia mentioned you were an excellent cook." "Mom taught home economics before switching to elementary education," Lydia explained. "She's always been practical that way." Helen smiled. "Teaching children requires practicality and patience in equal measure." "Speaking of practical matters," Ethan said, putting down his fork, "have you had a chance to review those documents I left with you?" Helen dabbed her lips with her napkin. "I have. I also discussed them with James O'Connor." Ethan's expression tightened momentarily. "As I mentioned, O'Connor's methods are outdated. I'm concerned he's not giving you the best advice for today's financial climate." "What financial climate exactly?" Helen asked innocently. "My teacher's pension is quite straightforward." An awkward silence fell over the table. Lydia looked between her mother and husband, confusion evident in her expression. "Mom, we're just trying to help," Lydia finally said. "Ethan has excellent financial advisors. They could review your situation, maybe find ways to increase your retirement income." Helen served apple pie for dessert, taking her time. "That's thoughtful, but unnecessary. Richard was very thorough in his planning. I have everything I need." Ethan leaned forward. "Helen, may I call you Helen? I think you might not fully understand the opportunities available to someone in your position. Property values in Charleston have skyrocketed. This house alone must be worth considerably more than what you and Richard paid for it." "It is," Helen acknowledged, "but it's my home, not an investment opportunity." "Of course," Ethan backpedaled smoothly. "I'm not suggesting selling it, but you could leverage its equity for other investments." Helen looked directly at him. "What investments would you suggest, Ethan?" Caught off guard by her directness, he hesitated. "Well, I have several business ventures that offer excellent returns. With the right capital infusion, they could provide substantial income for the entire family." "Ethan's developing a luxury marina complex," Lydia interjected proudly. "It's going to transform the waterfront." "How interesting," Helen replied. "Is financing in place?" Ethan's smile faltered. "We're in the final stages of securing investors. It's just a matter of showing sufficient collateral to satisfy the banks." The pieces clicked into place. Helen maintained her pleasant expression. "It sounds ambitious. I wish you every success." After dessert, Lydia helped clear the dishes while Ethan excused himself to take a phone call. In the kitchen, Helen seized the moment of privacy with her daughter. "Lydia, is everything all right with Ethan's business?" she asked gently. Lydia's eyes darted nervously to the dining room. "Of course. There are always challenges with major developments, but Ethan knows what he's doing. And the house you're looking at, it's within your budget." Lydia's expression hardened unexpectedly. "Mom, not everyone wants to live modestly like you and Dad did. Ethan has vision. He sees opportunities where others don't." "Vision is wonderful," Helen replied carefully, "but so is solid ground beneath your feet." "That's exactly why we want to help with your finances," Lydia countered. "So you have solid ground." "So we all do." Before Helen could respond, Ethan returned, his expression grim. "That was my project manager. We need to secure additional funding by the end of the month or risk losing our permits. Lydia's face fell. Can't your father help? He's already extended himself considerably, Ethan replied, his tone clipped. He believes in the project, but he's not a bottomless resource. Helen watched this exchange silently, understanding more with each passing moment. When they returned to the dining room for coffee, Ethan placed a pen and the power of attorney document beside Helen's cup. Helen, I don't mean to press, but time is of the essence. This arrangement would benefit everyone. Your assets would be professionally managed, and our family could consolidate resources more efficiently. Helen took the pen, but didn't sign. Ethan, I appreciate your concern, but I need to be transparent. Richard didn't leave substantial assets for me to manage. Our lifestyle was modest by choice, not necessity, but that doesn't mean there's hidden wealth. Ethan's charm evaporated entirely. With all due respect, Helen, I find that difficult to believe. Richard owned several beachfront properties that were rented to tourists. Those properties alone are worth millions in today's market. Helen felt a chill. He had done his research, but not thoroughly enough. Richard sold those properties years ago when the market peaked. The proceeds funded our retirement accounts and Lydia's education. It was a carefully constructed lie, but necessary. The properties existed, but under corporate names that couldn't be traced to the Marlowe family without insider knowledge. Mom, is that true? Lydia asked, confusion evident in her voice. Dad never mentioned selling anything. Your father was a private man, especially about finances, Helen replied evenly. He believed in security, not speculation. Ethan's expression hardened into something ugly. I think you're being manipulated, Lydia. Your mother is clearly hiding information about family assets that you have every right to know about. Helen maintained her composure. There's nothing to hide, Ethan. I live on my teacher's salary and Richard's pension. This house is my only significant asset, and it will go to Lydia eventually. The evening ended tensely, with Lydia torn between loyalty to her new husband and lifelong trust in her mother. As they left, Helen hugged her daughter tightly. I love you, Lydia. That will never change, no matter what. After they departed, Helen locked her door and leaned against it, finally allowing herself to tremble. The confrontation had been inevitable, but knowing that didn't make it any easier. She picked up her phone and texted Margaret, "Tea tomorrow. I could use a friend." Later that night, as she prepared for bed, Helen noticed headlights in her driveway. Peering through the curtains, she recognized Ethan's car. He sat there for nearly 10 minutes before driving away, having made no attempt to approach the house. The message was clear. This wasn't over. Helen checked her security system, another of Richard's prudent measures, before climbing into bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she had held her ground. Richard would have been proud. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a perfect Charleston spring day that belied the emotional storm brewing in Helen's life. She arrived at school early, finding comfort in the familiar routine of preparing her classroom for the day's lessons. Her third graders' enthusiasm and innocence provided a welcome respite from her personal concerns. During her lunch break, Helen called James O'Connor. It's escalating, she explained, keeping her voice low in the teacher's lounge. Ethan knows about the beachfront properties, though not that I still own them. That's concerning, James replied. He's been investigating Richard's business history. What should I do? Stay the course. The trust documents are being finalized as we speak. By week's end, everything will be legally secured. After school, Helen met Margaret at a small cafe several blocks from their neighborhood. Margaret, with her silver bob and penetrating gaze, had been Helen's neighbor and friend for 15 years. He sat in my driveway last night just watching the house, Helen explained, stirring her tea absently. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Intimidation tactics. I saw plenty of that on the bench. I'm more worried about Lydia. She's caught in the middle, and I can't tell her the truth without exposing exactly what Ethan is after. What about a compromise? Margaret suggested. Could you offer some financial assistance? Enough to satisfy Lydia that you're supportive, but not enough to solve Ethan's problems. Helen considered this. Perhaps. But it wouldn't address the underlying issue. Ethan believes there's a fortune to be had, and he won't stop until he gets it, or proves it doesn't exist. Then perhaps it's time for a different approach, Margaret said thoughtfully. Sometimes the best defense is a strategic offense. That evening, Helen received a text from an unknown number. We should talk privately about your situation. I can help. Meet tomorrow, Waterfront Park, 2 p.m. Come alone, Calvin Dreyer. Helen showed the message to Margaret, who had accompanied her home. Dreyer's making a side play, Margaret observed. He suspects you have assets and wants his cut, separate from Ethan. Should I meet him? Margaret considered the question carefully. Yes, but not alone. I'll be nearby, and we'll record everything. The following afternoon, Helen sat on a bench overlooking Charleston Harbor, watching tourists and locals stroll along the waterfront. Calvin Dreyer arrived precisely at 2 p.m., wearing an expensive suit despite the warm weather. Mrs. Marlowe, thank you for meeting me, he said, sitting beside her but maintaining a professional distance. Your message was intriguing, Mr. Dreyer. How exactly do you propose to help me? Dreyer glanced around before speaking. I've been reviewing public records related to your late husband's business activities. He was more resourceful than his teaching career would suggest. Helen remained impassive. Richard was good with our finances. Mrs. Marlowe, let's be direct. I know about the shell corporations, the property holdings, and the offshore accounts. What I don't know is why you're hiding this from your daughter and her husband. Helen felt a chill despite the warm sunshine. Richard had indeed used shell corporations, but there were no offshore accounts. Dreyer was fishing, combining facts with speculation. That's quite an imagination you have, Mr. Dreyer, she replied calmly. Not imagination, investigation. Ethan hired me to look into your finances, but I believe we could come to a more mutually beneficial arrangement. Are you suggesting something unethical, Mr. Dreyer? He smiled thinly. I'm suggesting practicality. I could report that my investigation found nothing substantial, just a teacher's pension and a paid-off house. In exchange, you might consider a consulting fee for my discretion. Blackmail, in other words, Helen stated flatly. A professional courtesy, he corrected. One that would keep your assets secure and Ethan off your back. Helen stood, smoothing her skirt. Mr. Dreyer, I appreciate your candor. However, I must decline your offer. There's nothing to find because there's nothing to hide. But I would suggest you consider the ethical implications of your proposal. The Bar Association takes a dim view of attorneys who attempt to extort their clients' family members. Dreyer's expression hardened. This isn't over, Mrs. Marlowe. Ethan is determined, and he has resources you may not anticipate. As do I, Mr. Dreyer. Good day. Helen walked away, her heart pounding but her stride steady. Margaret fell into step beside her as they rounded the corner. Got it all, Margaret confirmed, showing Helen the recording app on her phone. Let's get this to James immediately. That evening, Helen sat in her kitchen with James and Margaret, reviewing their strategy. The recording gives us leverage against Dreyer, James explained. He's violated multiple ethical guidelines. However, using it means exposing your financial situation publicly, which defeats the purpose of Richard's plan, Helen sighed. Not necessarily, Margaret interjected. The threat of exposure may be enough. Dreyer values his reputation. He won't risk disbarment. And Ethan? Helen asked. James looked troubled. That's more complicated. He's family, or at least connected to family. Legal maneuvers against him would inevitably affect Lydia. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Helen's phone lit up with Lydia's number. With a deep breath, she answered. Mum, we need to talk, Lydia said, her voice strained. Ethan's attorney found something concerning about Dad's business dealings. Can we come over tomorrow? Helen closed her eyes briefly. Of course, darling. What time works for you? After arranging the details, Helen ended the call and looked at her advisors. Tomorrow at noon. They're coming with evidence of Richard's business activities. This is it then, James said gravely. The moment of truth. How do you want to handle it? Helen thought carefully. I want you both here, but not visibly. I need to handle this myself with Lydia and Ethan, but having witnesses would be prudent. We'll be in the study, Margaret agreed. Close enough to intervene if necessary, but giving you space to manage this as a family matter. That night, Helen sat at her vanity looking at her reflection. The woman who gazed back had aged gracefully, her face lined with evidence of a life well lived, laughter, worry, joy, and sorrow, all etched into her features. Richard had loved those lines, calling them her wisdom map. What would you do, Richard? She whispered to the empty room. The answer came not in words, but in certainty. Richard would protect what they had built together, not out of selfishness, but because true love sometimes meant saying no to protect those you care about most, even from themselves. At precisely noon the following day, the doorbell rang. Helen opened it to find Lydia and Ethan on her doorstep, accompanied by Calvin Dreyer. She hadn't expected the attorney's presence, but maintained her composure. "Come in," she said, leading them to the living room where tea and cookies awaited, a teacher's instinct to provide comfort even in difficult situations. "Mom, we need to have a serious conversation," Lydia began, perching nervously on the edge of the sofa. "Ethan and Mr. Dreyer have discovered some concerning information about Dad's finances." Helen poured tea calmly. "What kind of information?" Ethan leaned forward eagerly. "Helen, we've uncovered evidence that Richard established several shell corporations that currently own prime beachfront properties. Properties worth approximately $80 million at current market values." Helen maintained a neutral expression. "That's quite a specific figure." "We've done thorough research," Dreyer interjected, pulling documents from his briefcase. "These properties are owned by corporations that we've traced back to Richard Marlowe. What we can't understand is why you've concealed these assets from your own daughter." Lydia looked at her mother, hurt evident in her eyes. "Mom, is this true? Did Dad leave you millions while letting me believe you were just getting by on your teacher's salary?" Helen set down her teacup, choosing her words carefully. Richard was indeed a careful investor. He believed in providing security for our future. "So you admit it," Ethan exclaimed triumphantly. "I haven't finished," Helen said firmly. "Richard also believed that wealth should be earned, not inherited. He was concerned about the effect sudden wealth might have on those not prepared for it." Lydia's expression shifted from hurt to confusion. "What are you saying?" Helen took a deep breath. "Richard did leave substantial assets, but with specific instructions about their management and distribution. Instructions I intend to honor." Ethan's face flushed with anger. "You have no right to withhold family assets from Lydia. She's Richard's daughter, his only child." "I'm not withholding anything," Helen replied evenly. "I'm managing Richard's legacy as he intended. Lydia will receive her inheritance when the time is right." "And when might that be?" Dreyer asked skeptically. "That's between Lydia and me," Helen stated. "It's a family matter." Ethan stood abruptly, pacing the room. "This is absurd. You're sitting on a fortune while Lydia and I are struggling to establish ourselves. My business needs capital now, not at some arbitrary future date you decide is right." And there it was, the truth laid bare. Helen looked at her daughter, whose expression revealed she was hearing this perspective for the first time. "Ethan, what do you mean? You told me your business was thriving," Lydia said, confusion evident in her voice. Ethan backpedaled quickly. "It is thriving in potential, but to realize that potential we need investment capital. Capital your mother is selfishly hoarding." Helen remained silent, allowing the dynamic to unfold between husband and wife. "This isn't about my mother being selfish," Lydia said slowly, realization dawning. "This is about you wanting access to my inheritance." Dreyer attempted to regain control of the situation. "Mrs. Marlowe, we're prepared to take legal action if necessary." As Richard's heir, Lydia has rights that cannot be circumvented by whatever arrangements you claim he made. You're welcome to pursue that course, Helen replied calmly. However, before you do, you should know that Richard's estate planning was meticulous and legally unassailable. Additionally, Mr. Dreyer, I have recorded evidence of your attempt to extort me at Waterfront Park yesterday. Dreyer's face paled visibly. That's a serious accusation. It is, Helen agreed. One supported by evidence that James O'Connor has already duplicated and secured. At that moment, the study door opened, and James and Margaret emerged, having heard everything. Dreyer recognized the former judge immediately and had the good sense to look alarmed. "This meeting is over," he announced, gathering his documents hastily. "Ethan, we need to reassess our strategy." Ethan looked frantically between his attorney and his wife. "Lydia, are you coming?" Lydia stood, visibly shaken. "I need time to think, Ethan. I'll get a ride home later." After Ethan and Dreyer departed, an uncomfortable silence filled the room. Lydia looked at her mother with new eyes, not angry, but bewildered. "Why didn't you tell me, Mom? About the money, about Dad's plans?" Helen moved to sit beside her daughter, taking her hands. "Your father wanted to protect you, Lydia, not from opportunity, but from the burden that sudden wealth can become. He wanted you to find your own path, build your own life. But Ethan and I could use that help now," Lydia protested weakly. "Could you?" Helen asked gently. "Or would it solve one problem while creating others? Ethan pursued you believing you were a teacher's daughter of modest means. What changed?" Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "He found some old photos of Dad at a property development, started asking questions about family money." James stepped forward. "Lydia, your father established trusts for both you and your mother. Yours activates on your 30th birthday, just 2 years from now. It provides substantial assets, but with structures to protect them from impulsive decisions or outside pressures. Like my husband's business ventures," Lydia said quietly, understanding dawning. "Like any external pressure," Helen corrected. "The money is yours, Lydia, not mine to give or withhold. Your father arranged it that way deliberately, with your best interests at heart." Lydia sat in silence for several minutes, processing this revelation. Finally, she looked up at her mother. "What do I do now? About Ethan? About everything?" Helen squeezed her daughter's hands. "That's entirely your decision, but whatever you choose, you won't face it alone. I'm here. I've always been here. Even when I seated you behind the flowers at my wedding?" Lydia asked, shame coloring her voice. Helen smiled gently. "Even then, love doesn't require perfect behavior, just an open heart." In the days that followed, Lydia moved temporarily into her old bedroom while she contemplated her future. Ethan made repeated attempts to reconcile, each less about emotion and more about financial arrangements. Dreyer quietly withdrew from the situation, his ethical violations hanging over him like Damocles' sword. One evening, as Helen and Lydia sat on the porch swing, watching fireflies emerge in the gathering dusk, Lydia broke their comfortable silence. "I've decided to file for annulment," she said quietly. "Ethan married me under false pretenses. His interest was never truly in me, but in what he thought I might bring to the relationship financially." Helen put her arm around her daughter. "Are you certain that's what you want?" "Yes," Lydia replied, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "When I asked him directly if he would still want to be married to me, if there was no inheritance coming, he couldn't answer. He talked about practical considerations and financial partnerships, not love, Mom. Not once did he mention love." Helen nodded, understanding the painful clarity that comes with such revelations. "I'm sorry it ended this way, darling." "I'm not," Lydia said, surprising her mother. "Dad was right. Money reveals character, both its presence and its absence. Ethan showed me who he really is, and I'm grateful I discovered it now, rather than years into our marriage. The process of legally ending the brief marriage was less contentious than expected. Ethan, facing mounting business debts and the collapse of his marina project, accepted a modest settlement in exchange for a clean break. Calvin Dreyer was quietly reported to the Bar Association, his career prospects diminished by his ethical violations. 6 months later, Helen sat in James O'Connor's office once again, reviewing the final resolution of all legal matters related to Richard's estate. "Everything is secure," James confirmed. "The properties remain in the trust, generating income that will support you comfortably for the rest of your life. Lydia's trust remains intact for her 30th birthday, and she'll be ready for it by then," Helen said confidently. "This experience has matured her considerably." James smiled. "Richard would be proud of how you handled everything. You maintained your dignity throughout, even when provoked." "I had good teachers," Helen replied. "Richard's foresight and your counsel." "And your own strength," James added. "Never discount that." That evening, Helen hosted a small dinner party, just Lydia, Margaret, and James. The table was set with Richard's favorite dishes, and his photograph stood on the sideboard, his kind eyes seeming to watch over them. "I've been thinking about next steps," Lydia announced as they enjoyed dessert. "I've applied to graduate school, educational psychology. I want to help children like the ones Mom has taught all these years." "That's wonderful," Helen said, genuine pride warming her voice. "And I've been researching something else," Lydia continued. "A foundation, one that would provide scholarships for students from low-income families. I thought we might call it the Richard Marlowe Educational Trust." Helen felt tears spring to her eyes. "Your father would love that." "I know," Lydia said softly. "I may not have understood all his decisions, but I understand his values now. He believed in earning your way, but also in helping others climb the ladder. That's the legacy I want to build with my portion of his gift." Margaret raised her glass. "To Richard's legacy, not just of wealth, but of wisdom." As they toasted, Helen gazed around the table at the people she loved most in the world. The past year had brought challenges she never anticipated, forcing her to stand firm when it would have been easier to yield. But in doing so, she had honored not just Richard's final wishes, but the principles they had shared throughout their marriage. Later, after the guests had departed and Lydia had gone up to bed, Helen sat alone in the sunroom, looking out at the garden Richard had lovingly tended for decades. The moonlight silvered the roses, creating a peaceful tableau that matched the serenity in her heart. "We did it, Richard," she whispered to the night air. "We protected what matters most." A gentle breeze stirred the curtains, almost like a responding touch. Helen smiled, knowing that true love sometimes meant standing your ground, even when the whole world seemed to be pushing against you. Sometimes the greatest act of love was simply saying no to protect both yourself and those you cherished most. In the quiet of the evening, with the weight of conflict finally lifted from her shoulders, Helen Marlowe, teacher, widow, mother, and guardian of a legacy greater than mere wealth, closed her eyes and felt at last completely at peace. If you enjoyed this story about strength, dignity, and the true meaning of inheritance, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps us continue bringing these meaningful narratives to life. Thank you for joining Helen on her journey of courage and conviction.